So today we're going to talk about format compliance and whether it's a requirement for requirement writing. This is a conversation that we have a lot, and certainly one that seems to be gaining traction as projects become more and more complex. The introduction of AI, robotics, stricter regulations around requirements throughout many of the industries that we work with, certainly. Our organization, QRA, have a number of guides and resources that we put together over the years around tips and techniques to improve your requirement writing. And our documents and resources around the ears patterns, which we will discuss in our presentation today, are always our most downloaded. So if you haven't had the chance to check out our definitive guide for ears or any of our other documents, again, please feel free to reach out and we can share the link to those. So today we're going to be talking about what is format compliance and why is it important. We're going to show you how to write requirements using ears with the assistance of QVscribe, the templates and compliance checks that we have within our software, which again, we'll touch a bit on in a moment here. And then we're going to talk about elevating requirements by ensuring format compliance. So a little bit about us. We are QRA. We are based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. You can see an aerial view of Halifax on the right-hand side there. We started with a formal analyzer for model-based system engineering within the aerospace and defense industry. Our first tool is called QVtrace, and we're looking for perfect storm scenarios within models. What we realized was that a lot of the issues we were finding within the models were the result of requirements that were guiding them. So poorly defined requirements led to poorly built models that led to a significant number of issues. We looked to the market to find a complementary tool to improve the requirements, and it didn't exist. So we built it. That became our second tool, which is QVscribe. So over time, we realized what the market already knew, that most of these issues found at all project stages were actually originating because of poorly defined requirements. So we focused all of our attention on improving QVscribe, and that's what we've been doing for the last roughly 6 years. We've now expanded our customer base, and we work with the industry leaders among complex safety critical engineering teams in oil and energy, defense and space, automotive, transportation, government, aerospace, consulting, and medical services. So to introduce who you're going to be hearing from today, my name is Justin Tweed. I've been with QRA for just over a year. I'm an account executive, mainly focused on the pre-sale side of things. So my experience is with customers who are looking to make improvements to their requirement processes and overall development process, and typically running into project delays, verification issues, misinterpretations, and other sort of issues as a result of poorly defined requirements that our software and format compliance techniques can help resolve. Danielle Power is our onboarding and training manager. She has been with QRA for 4 years. She ensures all of our users can fully implement QVscribe into the requirement workflow and properly understand how to leverage it. So she works on the post-sales side of things and follows customers as they improve their processes through the use of QVscribe and format compliance techniques. Danielle has seen firsthand the huge difference that these tools can provide. Preet Kaur is our product manager. She is responsible for product strategy and roadmap for all QVscribe product lines. She has been with QRA for 1.5 years. And Preet leverages the information provided by Danielle, myself, and all of our frontline colleagues in regards to what issues are plaguing our customer base and finds ways to implement solutions for those problems within QVscribe. So who are you? This discussion can really benefit you no matter what stage in your requirement journey you are. Whether you're a process authority, looking for standards to implement across your organization to ensure that everyone is on the same page and you can be confident that processes will be predictable and repeatable. A requirement leader who is looking for ways to help their team out in the complex task of requirement creation and ensure that they can meet the strict timelines, cost expectations of projects. Or requirement authors who are looking for ways to take some of the complication and critical thinking out of their own role and be able to stand out from the crowd with the quality of their work. So now we're going to put up our quick poll. If you can please just add your input and then we'll get started. So we'll just give another 15 seconds or so on the poll. Really appreciate everyone putting their input there. We'll discuss the results towards the end. All right. With that, I will pass it over to Preet, and she's going to introduce format compliance and why is it important. Preet.
Thanks, Justin. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. It's hard to talk about format compliance without talking about requirement engineering first. So let's start there. Purpose of requirement engineering at the core is to ensure that a product or a system meets the needs of the stakeholders and is delivered on time, within budget, and is high quality. It seems like a pretty straightforward activity at the foundation when I put it in a one sentence like this, but it gets extremely complex as we start taking into account all the variables at play, how they evolve over time, and the subjective nature of a lot of it. At QRA, we get a chance to work with some of the most advanced requirement writing teams. And I can assure you that no two developments are the same. The skill, complexity, risk, novelty, and even the composition of the project teams all vary between the projects and the companies. The one constant between all of this change is usually the struggle between alignment, communication, and like the dynamic nature of this process, really. This can add quite a bit of overhead, especially for the requirement teams. And to be honest, the whole project really feels it from a monetary side, timeline side as well. Some of the most common issues like that we see are lack of stakeholder engagement, misalignment of stakeholders, like the result turning out to be ambiguous requirements or changes in requirements at a later stage of the project, completely changing, the timeline or the scope or like cost of the project. At the end, question really being like, what do we do about this? I believe systemizing the requirement process is key here. This is the most successful practice that we've seen with our own customers. As you start systemizing the requirement writing workflow by breaking it into the repeatable steps, creating repeatable process to execute the steps, and building in a feedback mechanism for the process that you've set up, things start really becoming more repeatable and predictable. We start creating a baseline and start analyzing what's working and what's not working. This basically lets us like tackle things that are not working one at a time rather than, like tackling this whole thing one as a big thing. Format compliance offers many benefits throughout the requirement engineering process. It helps reduce errors arising from misalignment, lack of communication, or miscommunication. It helps reduce ambiguity. Because everything is laid out and communicated exactly the same way to everyone. Everyone already has an idea of what they can expect, what's expected of them, and when. It helps increase consistency with everybody now being on the same page as their references align now. And then it also helps improve the overall quality of the project outcome because we start addressing the root cause issues threatening of the quality of the project in a systematic manner incrementally. I've broken out the requirement engineering process in a very simple pipeline here. You start by essentially identifying who your stakeholders are, like meeting them, understanding what is it that they need from the product and the system. Once you've gathered everybody's feedback, you're ready to start putting together those requirements. Once you have documented everything, it's ready for review and seeing if it is actually aligned with what stakeholders needed. Stakeholders at different stages of this process also change, just like it depends on the context. Once you have feedback from everybody's review, you update the requirements with the necessary changes. Once the requirements are actually ready, your dev team takes over. They actually start implementing and executing on the intent of your project and deliver a product or a system. Once dev team is happy, then it basically goes to the quality assurance team that goes and validates that the end product actually meets what was listed out in the requirements and it functions well for the user. As for this particular presentation, we're only going to focus on discussing how to systemize the step of documenting the requirements. If any of these steps, like if you would like us to present on like how to systemize different steps in the rest of the pipeline, please post in comments. I'm sure we'll be happy to put a webinar together for that. Right. As you guys can probably already guess, one of the best ways to systemize a requirement documentation is format compliance. Format compliance refers to adhering to a specific set of guidelines or standards for documenting requirements. These guidelines can include things like the structure or organization of the requirements, one of the examples being ears. It also refers to the use of specific terminology or acronyms that are well understood by the team, like a company glossary or something. And it also refers to providing the level of detail that every requirement needs to have. So everything has a consistency to it. There are many benefits of format compliance. I'm just going to name a few to actually articulate how it affects the whole process and how it can be so beneficial. Requirement structure guideline, which is part of the format compliance, helps laying out the guideline for the expected syntax, setting the expectation with what components are expected in that syntax, and when different syntaxes should be used. This helps with everybody already being aware with what type of information they're expected to convey in a requirement, what information they need to collect for a requirement, and that leads to a very concise output as there's no room for missing information or additive information. Requirement structure guideline, in combination with glossary implementation, can help user write requirements that are very streamlined and unambiguous. Any words like that have an inherent meaning can be looked up in the glossary. And the requirement syntaxes don't really leave much room for ambiguity because of easy isolation or identification of any of the requirement components and if they're missing. Agreement in layout of expected requirement structure doesn't just help the authors. It's extremely helpful for the reviewers as well. Usually, even from the first word onwards, reviewer already knows if they're reading an event-driven requirement or state-driven or ubiquitous. This means that main review time is actually spent on alignment of the contents of the requirements, rather than identifying and answering open-ended questions like, what can this requirement be missing? Does it include everything that we need? In this case, reviewers spend time on evaluating if they actually agree that the trigger specified is accurate. Is the mentioned system response correctly laid out? Is this actually a ubiquitous or an event-driven requirement? You can actually have those conversations. Most format compliance standards require little to no training. So the ramp up period for your entire team to start using and abiding by the same syntax and glossary is very limited. Majority of the effort is actually just like spent on consistent usage of ears or format compliance. One of the most common requirement syntax followed in requirement engineering teams is ears. So I would like to pass to Justin to help us learn more about that.
Thanks a lot, Preet. So to talk about ears a little bit, ears is the most commonly used format compliance technique that we see, certainly amongst our customer base. Again, we cover complex engineering projects, typically in safety critical spaces. So to introduce ears, the easy approach to requirement syntax, or ears, is a set of 5 patterns for writing natural language requirements. They take the guesswork away from the formatting of requirements, instead allow engineers to focus on the content of the requirements themselves. So the most evident feature to identify an ears compliant requirement is that preconditions always come at the beginning of the requirement, and then the system response always comes at the end. So let's take a look at the 5 patterns. You can see them along the side here. So ubiquitous requirements are called that because they're always active. They're not invoked by an event or an input, nor are they limited to a subset of the system's operating states. So a ubiquitous requirement written in the ears format looks like replace the system with the name of the system, shall being the imperative of your choice, and then the system response coming at the end. Event-driven requirements state-driven requirements are active throughout the time a defined state remains true. So looking at this, easily identified by a while statement in the specific state being the precondition, the system, shall, system response. Event-driven requirements require response only when an event is detected at the system boundary. So this is clearly identified by the when statement. Your trigger statement would follow, trigger statement of your choice, of course. And then again, the system, shall, imperative of your choice, system response. Requirements that apply only when an optional feature is present as a part of the system are indicated by the keyword where. So an optional feature requirement have the following syntax being where. Feature is included, the system, shall, system response. Unwanted behavior is a general term used to cover all situations that are undesirable. Since it is good system engineering practice to anticipate these undesirable situations and impose requirements to mitigate them, ERS includes a provision for such requirements, being if unwanted behavior, then the system, shall, system response. Looking at these patterns here, you can see that it's pretty consistent throughout, with the difference being really the first word. So again, this really makes things easy to identify from an authoring standpoint. If I'm writing this type of requirement, what do I start with? And then it's easily going to be finished the other way. And again, from a reviewing or actually implementation standpoint, it's clear what it is. To talk a little bit more about unwanted behavior patterns, it's a major source of omission we see in requirements, and this necessitates costly rework. So it's good requirement engineering practice to write unwanted behavior requirements in a second pass. So you've written your requirements for normal conditions, and then on the second pass, you examine the normal operation requirements you've written to see if any unwanted behaviors, unwanted conditions, or inputs need to be mitigated. So beyond these 5 base patterns, there are complex patterns that combine 2 or more of these patterns. And we're going to talk about more about that in our complex patterns in our next webinar. So now that you're familiar with the patterns, we're going to touch on when it makes sense to actually not use ERS. So although the flexibility of ERS make them a great default starting point, industry agnostic, and really situation agnostic, level agnostic, there could be a number of reasons that the ERS patterns are actually a bad choice. We're going to touch on a few of those reasons, mostly related again to the safety critical system requirements that we typically work with as an organization. So if forcing a requirement into format compliance like ERS actually adds complexity to the requirements or requires you to sacrifice important information so as to adhere to the rules of the pattern, then it may be better to actually avoid the pattern instead of sacrificing the quality of the requirement. For example, sometimes it may make more sense to create a requirement that actually references a graph, diagram, or decision table. Decision tables can also be useful when a requirement has more than 3 preconditions. Because requirement best practices and ERS guidelines enforce a requirement to be a single sentence, being an atomic requirement, requirements that have many preconditions can actually just become bulky and more confusing by trying to jam them into an ERS pattern. So sometimes you may be better avoiding them in that situation. Oftentimes we see requirements that are mathematic in nature. Naturally, these requirements will not fit into textual patterns like ERS. So as such, they're better left in other states. And this could also be true for requirements that are solely going to require interaction from a specific audience. If everyone who needs to understand a requirement comes from the same background, let's say software engineering, it may make sense to create requirements that are more easily understood by software engineers and not worry about stakeholders that aren't related to that, who don't have to interact with these specific requirements. So in a moment here, Danielle is going to show you how to leverage our software, QVscribe, to create and confirm compliance to ERS patterns. So first, let me briefly introduce QVscribe. We're not going to talk too much about QVscribe today, But of course, it is our software. And if you are interested in learning more about how QVscribe can help improve efficiency, communication, predictability in your development process, please reach out afterwards and we can connect. So within QVscribe, we have 3 base analyses. The first being quality analysis. This is a risk score for each requirement. It's looking for unclear language, ambiguous language that has a risk of being misinterpreted at these latter stages, and then language that isn't going to be testable. It's not going to be verifiable. How do you prove that this language and this requirement has been met? Our consistency analysis looks for all of the terms and units that have been used throughout using natural language processing, and it's ensuring that you're being consistent on the names that you're referring to an object in. You're not using multiple names for the same object, and you're not working in different system of units. Of course, we want to make those conversions prior to the implementation of the requirements themselves. Similarity is comparing requirement to requirement, mainly looking for 3 things. Highly similar requirements, of course, could be a duplication. Do these both need to be within this document? They could be a duplication, but they both need to be within the document. Maybe we've omitted certain information that makes them discernible from each other and able to be actioned on their own. And then contradiction. We usually see that highly similar requirements can actually contradict each other with one simple unit or one simple statement that you made that differs from one to the other. So this is what the similarity check is looking for. Additionally, there are templates and conformance checks to assist in ERS compliant requirements. So this software integrates into Word, Excel, and leading requirement management tools. For today, Danielle is going to show you how to use QVscribe to help you write ERS requirements within Polarian. Danielle?
Perfect. Thank you, Justin. I think that was a great introduction to ERS and to QVscribe. What I'm going to be doing is demonstrating how you can use our ERS templates, and I'm going to be doing that within our integration with Polarian. So can you see my screen? Just making sure I've now taken over. I'll take that as a yes. Perfect. I wanted to really go through how to write ERS requirements, a couple of the more simple templates, and then I wanted to work through a requirement that is, pretty poorly written, has, a 1 out of 5 in QVscribe, which is the worst score you can get in QVscribe. And I really just want to kind of walk through everyone on how you can use these templates and how easy and clear they can be. The example I'm going to use today is a garage door opener. This is really to keep it kind of simple and easy for everyone so we can understand, and also for myself. So first I'm going to start off with writing a new requirement. So you can see, this, even though it's getting a 1 out of 5 in QVscribe, we haven't started there. So I'll cut myself a little slack there. Right off the bat, QVscribe is kind of giving me a little bit of an overview. So you're going to see our alerts here. I don't have an imperative, which automatically gives me that 1 out of 5, and I'm not compliant to ERS. So I want to write an ERS requirement. First, we're going to do ubiquitous. So ubiquitous, as Justin kind of went through, is a requirement that is always active. So we're not contingent on any of the, an optional feature, any preconditions, any triggers. So it is always active, and this is the template that we would use. So with this context, I wanted to write a requirement where the garage door opener always displays the status. So I want to know if the garage door opener is active and on or inactive and off. So I'll kind of walk through each component a little bit more. So in this case, the system is the system that's being specified. So it's what must provide the required response. So in this case, for my garage door opener, my system is the garage door opener. Imperative. So imperative is a very fundamental part of a requirement. If you don't have an imperative within your requirement, it's not clear that what is being asked to be done by the garage door opener is mandatory. Is it actually? It's hard to discern whether
Sorry
or not
to interrupt,
actually.
Danielle.
Yeah.
Just had a request. If is it possible for you to make this any larger?
Larger. Yeah. Let me. I zoom in, would that work? Is that any bigger?
Yeah, maybe do a couple more. Yeah, I think that still shares all of the information.
Perfect.
Vanita, is that better for your view there? Does that okay? Perfect. Thanks for
Sorry, I saw
thanks for
some
adding that in
comments
there.
coming in, but I thank you for taking that, Justin. Perfect. Okay, great. So now we could see it a little bit clearer. That's great. So the system is the garage door opener. The imperative, we often recommend using shall. This tends to be pretty common across most industries. There are other possible imperatives that people can use like will, but shall is usually a good one to kind of consistently use. And then lastly, what I need is to write down the system response. So this is the desired kind of result of what the system or the subject is going to kind of produce. So in this case, I want it to display the power status. Oh, nice caps there. So now you can see if I go back to QVscribe, I have a 5 out of 5 requirement, which EARS makes really kind of a lot simpler to get. And it is understanding that this is compliant with the ubiquitous template. So it's going to break down everything I just did. So that is our first template. Next, I'm going to dive into, I would like to go through an unwanted behavior template. So what Justin kind of mentioned and that we often see is these are kind of the most omitted kind of requirements. People tend to not really want to think about undesirable events or things that could go wrong. So it's always good, as Justin recommended, to kind of do this on the second pass. But what's really great is you have access to these templates. The EARS templates are going to show you, don't forget about your unwanted behavior requirements. So I'm going to use the unwanted behavior template directly into my work item there. And in this case, I want to talk about, I want the garage door to go into like an emergency setting, emergency mode, if there's an obstruction blocking the door. So I don't want the door to shut and maybe get damaged. So I need to be aware that sometimes there's obstructions. So in this case, we're going to be talking about the trigger. So the trigger is in both event-driven and unwanted behavior, we talk about triggers. Event-driven requirements are going to be talking about a desired event, whereas unwanted behavior are going to be talking about the undesirable events. So the way that those are kind of differentiated is in event, we say when, and in unwanted behavior, we say if, trigger, and then. So the trigger in this case is if the, let's say, door sensor detects an obstruction, then, and then again, what we want to do is write our system, which is the garage door opener. The imperative that we really like to use is shall. And the system response in this case is we want it to enter emergency mode. So if I go back to QVscribe, again, it was super easy to get that 5 out of 5. And my EARS compliance check is picking up exactly what I used. So it knows what the trigger is, it knows what the system is, imperative, and the system response. So that is how you can use our EARS templates to kind of author new requirements. Now I'm going to go into a requirement that has a few problems. This is one that was already written. It is saying the garage door opener turns the light on while it is opening. So I understand what we're trying to get across, but its first problem, we don't have imperative. Big fundamental of a requirement. We need to ensure that we have, that we're saying that something needs to be done. And the other one is a cross-referencing pronouns. We're using it. I mean, it's probably, I think I understand they're talking about the garage door, but it's always important that that we are giving the proper unique name of a term or of an entity. Sometimes people tend to not do this because it's repetitive, but when it comes to requirements, that's a good thing. You need to be consistent with your language and the terms that you're using. And this can be quite ambiguous. If this particular requirement is pulled out of this document and given to someone, they might not understand it fully. So it's really important that we give proper names to nouns. So what I'm actually going to do is, this does look like a state-driven requirement. So I'm going to use the state-driven template to rewrite this requirement. So we are saying, that during a specific period of time that, the system is going to go into this state. So I would say in this case, the precondition, which is almost like the prerequisite for activating kind of the specific system response that you're looking for. So the system, as it says here, has to be in this state for the system response to happen. So here it would be, our precondition would be, while the garage, I don't need capital, garage door is open, the system, again, pretty consistent across this document, garage door opener, and our imperative will be shall, and the system response in this case is turn the light on. So we can go ahead and remove this. We could have removed it from the start, but it's nice to maybe work off of your previous information. So you can kind of very clearly see what you're trying to get across, but use the template to better kind of articulate and to be more consistent, so that if someone pulls up this requirement, they're going to see the while, they're going to know we're talking about a straight state-driven requirement. And yeah, perfect. I am getting 5 out of 5, and now I am compliant with ears. Perfect. Did we have, I do see a question. Happy to, has the ears templates been used within QVscribe? So you can use it directly within QVscribe. Essentially, if you went into, let's say, open the item, so there's multiple ways that you can look at QVscribe. So it's right within your document, or you can go directly into the item, but it will be through QVscribe button to insert the template. So there's multiple ways that you can use the ears kind of template depending on how you're reviewing your information in Polarian directly in the document or through the work items, but it will be through the QVscribe button.
Yeah, so just to jump on that, QVscribe, again, as I mentioned before, it has integrations into many requirement management tools, and then also Word and Excel is typically kind of the where a lot of teams are still working within, or if we don't necessarily work directly within your requirement management tool, typically it works via export into Excel. And this feature of writing in ears is featured in all of the versions of QVscribe, so you'd be able to use that wherever you're actually creating your requirements.
I do see a question about example of a complex template. We were actually looking at going into dealing with high-risk requirements and going over the complex templates in our next webinar. I'm happy to send over some examples to you if you would like, Samir. Or if Justin kind of wants to pick up from here, I could probably gather an example pretty quickly. I'll kind of leave it. I'll leave from what I was trying to do at the moment. We walked through kind of how to write those few examples, and yeah, I'll send a few examples over to you, Samir. We'll be going through that in our next webinar.
Great. Yeah, if we have time at the end, we can touch on that briefly to introduce it. Simone, I see that you mentioned here that Doors Next is your requirement management software of choice. That is another area that we actually do have a direct integration into. So basically, obviously the UI is different within Doors Next, but all the functions of QVscribe that I introduced prior to Danielle here, and then as well, these ears templates and the conformance checks are actually available within Doors Next as well. So yeah, if you're interested in chatting about that, we can reach out afterwards and we can have a discussion. Great. Thank you very much for that, Danielle. So thanks for the questions already, guys. Keep them coming in. Yeah, we're just about done here, and then we'll just have some discussion and some question period at the end here. But really appreciate you guys adding in. So yeah, just to kind of round up what we're talking about today, is format compliance a requirement for requirement writing? It is important to remember that it's more than just engineers that need to interact with requirements. Format compliance simplifies requirements to a syntactic structure that can be easily created and can be easily understood by people of all backgrounds that need to interact with those requirements. So, whether that means a stakeholder who isn't privy to the jargon of engineers, or somebody who may be third language English and learn the grammatical patterns that don't necessarily align with the commonly used ones within our organization's home base. Of course, organizations are very international these days, and typically we see requirement writing being done in English, but people come from all backgrounds, and these structures that you write in may not be familiar with the way that people have learned their English. What it does is it creates understood patterns that can clearly identify the when is this relevant of a requirement. Ultimately, this leads to less back and forth between those creating the requirements, everyone who must interact with them. So when you're actioning requirements for design, development, verification, individuals can identify the ears patterns by identifying whether, when, where, if, etc. And they're quickly able to determine whether this requirement is relevant at all times, it's only relevant in certain states, or only after a certain event. And of course, this makes it much easier and faster to decipher than deciphering individuals' choice of syntax and language to determine what sort of requirement this is. Of course, if the incorrect ears pattern is used, the opposite can be true. So an individual actioning requirements could incorrectly action a requirement based on an incorrect pattern usage and have a feature that is supposed to be relevant at all times, for example, that's only relevant in a certain state. So it needs to be well understood exactly what ears pattern needs to be used, format compliance in general. So for this and for other reasons, having blanket best practices across the entirety of the requirement process is typically not best practices. Lower level requirements that need only be reviewed and actioned by software engineers, for example, they may be more easily understood and implemented in a completely different format. This is part of the reason why format compliance is not the be-all, end-all, but it is very crucial. And it is important to understand when it actually complicates things more than it simplifies them. Danielle, do you want to jump on top of that?
Yeah, I think what's great about this panel is we all have different interactions with, the reaction from our customers about format compliance, and also kind of what we end up discussing. So I just wanted to give a little bit of insight into some of the things that I've really noticed. So in general, I find the templates are really going to help avoid a lot of the common requirement errors. So I know Justin kind of had that list of all of the things that QVscribe is going to help with the quality analysis and with consistency and similarity. Ears is really going to help avoid potential problems. So if you're using our templates, I'll start my video so people can see me. So if you're using our kind of the ears templates, it's really going to cut down on the chances of running into these problems. You have a very clear structure. There's ears are always going to be singular. You're not going to run into the problem of non-atomic requirements, which is a pretty common issue to have kind of multiple requirements kind of linked together through bullet points or ABC lists, or even just paragraph together. So ears are going to be singular and one sentence, so you're not going to run into that problem. No imperatives or multiple imperatives. Ears only leaves room for one imperative, and it's also telling you need to have your imperative there. So one of the issues that's going to get you a 1 out of 5 in QVscribe right away is going to be kind of issues with imperatives. So really having that template to kind of guide you up front is going to make it much easier. And then lastly, just avoiding vague and ambiguous language. The structure is very straightforward and clear and kind of leaves little room to add that ambiguity and vagueness. Now, with that being said, just because you use the ears templates doesn't mean you automatically have a clear, concise requirement. There are still possible issues or possible language problems that could come up, but the structure is really going to help you start off on a really good foot. And the other thing I've personally really noticed is the impact of using ears across teams. So we've actually seen a few customers and teams who have even mandated the use of ears for kind of requirement writing. And some of the kind of things that they've noted and that we've noticed is, significantly reducing requirement errors compared to like previous projects. Or kind of lowering the percentage of errors that become, errors in implementation, and minimizing error correction costs. There's a lot of cost and time savings. Most of these initiatives as well have been quite recent. So I'm really excited and kind of intrigued to see what the long-term impacts and benefits will be across these teams and their projects. So that's some insight into kind of my interaction with our customers and how they're using templates. Preet, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I both of you guys made really great points, and I feel like you guys covered like a lot there. Like from my experience, like any of the customers that we talked to, like some of the main things that they really benefit from using this is the amount of time that they end up saving in the whole process, and how happy they are with a lot of the alignment things that they were struggling with initially, where like those things just disappear, and now they can actually focus on what they wanted to focus on together, which was like, what is the actual content trying to say in requirements. So like, yeah, like if you guys are struggling with any of these things, then format compliance is definitely something I would highly, highly suggest for you to kind of take a look at and see if this can benefit your team. Some of the things I would highly also suggest, like, like keeping in mind when you're getting started with this is like, having a very solid like implementation process. How are you going to get that buy-in from your team? How are you going to make sure like everybody knows what the expected, like format is and use cases, like how are you going to be using this across your whole process? Having the right tools, actually giving your team tools to not only write, but also check what they're writing. Like, like if they actually tried to write event-driven, was it actually compliant? Can really take away like a lot of the confusion points for them. Like QVscribe can be an amazing help for that. And then once you're through with that, then the review part where all of the reviewers, stakeholders come in, having a proper like conformance process for this implementation, where you're seeing like, okay, is the right template used? Do we have the right components here? Is the intent getting captured completely? And then if you're working with very large documents, bringing in ears with combination with QVscribe and almost like in combination with requirement management tools, for the larger projects where traceability comes in, can really formulate a very solid solution that can work for like majority of the projects I've worked with. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks everyone here and everyone who contributed questions. We do have a couple of additional questions in here, and we'll get to those in just a moment. I'm just going to touch on what we have upcoming from a webinar standpoint. So towards the end of April, early May, we don't have a strict date on it yet. We're going to set up a panel discussion about AI in requirements. So what we're going to do is not be a product-focused webinar, but it's going to be a conversation amongst industry professionals to share their thoughts on what's to come in requirement engineering with platforms like ChatGPT and bar becoming very relevant in the requirement space. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have a second of a 4-part series on this. We are going to be focusing on, that's going to be coming towards late June. And we're going to be focusing in that one on the EARS format, using the EARS format to avoid the use of common high-risk problems found in natural language requirements. And then again, how you can optimize EARS complex templates in your requirements and projects. So we will get a lot into the complex patterns at that point, but we'll try to touch on that today if we get these questions answered as well. So yeah, again, just to reiterate, if you did see anything that interests you and you wanted to figure out about your unique situation at your organization, again, anything around kind of requirement quality in general, or learning a little bit more about how EARS and format compliance could potentially fit into your situation, please feel free to reach out. QVscribe, we're happy to set up trials on as well. Happy to have conversations around that. But for now, we'll leave it where it is and we'll touch on some questions, and please feel free to reach out if you do have any interest in learning a little bit more about that. So questions, keep them coming in here. Oh, and Yana just reminded me we do have the poll results to share. So actually, maybe we'll touch on that first. Yana, do you have that? Perfect. Okay, so it seems like the sentiment here, which is great, kind of aligns perfectly with what we're intending to continue to do with this series, is that people are still working on figuring it out here. So yeah, that's great. What we'll do is continue to dig in a little bit deeper and, talk about the benefits and talking about how it really adds to your requirement process here. So really appreciate everybody contributing their answers there. And yeah, what we'll do is get into the questions here. So the first question I see, in your experience working with various industries, what would you say is the biggest obstacle when it comes to adopting compliance and requirement templates? I think Danielle, you're probably well suited for that, working with our customer base.
Yeah, I would say the word that comes to mind is consistency, but I think a lot of it, there's a lot of contributing factors. So, buy-in, that's kind of a big thing. It's if one team or one project is working on EARS templates, or one part of a team during a project, if you're not kind of consistently using it, I find there can be, the effectiveness can get a little bit lost, right? If someone's pulling up a requirement that's event driven and not everyone is using a similar statement, you could lose the meaning behind it. So I think the biggest thing is being able to use it consistently across teams and projects is probably kind of the biggest kind of issue and roadblock I've seen for some teams. We do kind of recommend almost like a tiered approach to it, because really if we could recommend it and that we've seen most effective would be kind of mandating it. We know that's not really appropriate for some, or not the best first step for a lot of people. So really starting to use the EARS templates, analyzing your requirements with QVscribe and seeing how many are EARS conformant can help too. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. Yes. So a second one we have here, do you think that EARS formatting is a permanent fixture in requirements writing? Preet, you're focused on the product and the future of the way that the product's going here. So do you mind touching on that?
Yeah, absolutely. QVscribe, so the question is how does EARS QVscribe address requirement hierarchies? So currently,
no, sorry, Preet, we're just first here, we're just talking about if we think that EARS is going to be permanent in requirement writing, or whether we see it a future in EARS. We'll get to that, though. We'll get to that one next.
Sure. Thanks, Justin. So basically, it really depends on your use case. I do have to stress that, EARS is one of the standards. It's a very widely used standards in requirement engineering, so it's highly recommended. But it really comes down to your use case, how complex your requirements are, what your preferred writing style is, and everything. As far as how we've seen EARS perform is we have EARS being used in multitudes of industries across our customers right now, and like the sentiment is like really happy with it. Yours was also like launched like what, 15 years ago, and it's still like, it's been used like consistently in the same way, even with like evolving tools with like, like ChatGPT, Bard coming in, and how like, like people are starting to actually get help to write requirements or review requirements. You're still continues to play that foundational role of just like, making sure that communication and alignment across the customer. So I very much feel like it's something that can carry on because it's so fundamental.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Preet. Maybe that first question that you're starting to answer as well, that's our next question in line here. Did you want to add there? I'll just read off the question. How does EARS/QVscribe address requirement hierarchies and dependencies?
Sure, I can add my 2 cents, and then like, you feel free to jump in too. So EARS in particular is like, like it's used for getting the intent out. There are some formats in EARS which actually help you like link some requirements to, if you want, like with the arrows and stuff, but it really depends like which type of implementation the team is doing. When hierarchies come in, I feel like it's really your requirement document structure that can start helping, like how you actually put things in sections. And then this is where like when things get complex and you're working with like larger projects, the RM tools come in where you can start doing that traceability matrix and seeing like how one thing depends on another, what is the relationship between different things, because EAR's main thing is to convey intent. The hierarchies and everything is like, the tools that you're using with it can actually help. So QVscribe is really great, but like actually seeing like, okay, which system is being used and which of the terms are being used in which requirements. And if you're using different types of terms, if your terms are changing across the document, that's something QVscribe can help with, which can kind of allude to like your hierarchy in the requirement as well.
Yeah, and I think that actually leads in really well. I'll jump on top of that and lead that into the next question that we have here, which is how do these formats reconcile with typical user story? And they gave an example of a user story as a role, I want something so that benefit. So I think this kind of touches on what Preet mentioned there as well. Specifically within QVscribe, I'll mention that it's a very configurable tool. So these aspects of requirement analysis and quality that we briefly showed you, highlighting, that it omitted an imperative statement and used a cross-referencing pronoun in the example that Danielle showed earlier. These are completely configurable to your liking. So if you determine that, at this level, the user story level, let's say, for example, you're not concerned about having an imperative statement in there, or you're completely loose on what is an imperative statement, you can completely customize that to yourself. So you could say that, okay, in this situation, I'm writing a user story, needs is good enough as an imperative, or again, I don't want to concern myself with imperatives altogether. So you can remove that altogether. To jump back on, what we kind of talked about before, EARS isn't always the best pattern determined on the situation, but certainly there are situations in the user stories level where the EARS patterns will still work fine. It's really just about determining whether it's adding to the complexity of things or it's actually simplifying it, because the goal of EARS requirement tools in general, like QVscribe, is to simplify the process. And ultimately, if you determine that it's going to complicate things, then it might be better to omit that. It looks like nobody has anything else to share. I know that we did mention the complex pattern. Danielle, do you think you have enough time there? Otherwise, we can just follow up with, I believe it was Samir afterwards.
We have what, 3 minutes? Yeah, I think I could probably get that in 3 minutes. So as I mentioned, we will be going through some more complex examples and a little bit more in detail, but I did have a quick one that I can kind of walk through. So let me just share my screen. So I had an example that we actually happen to have kind of ready to go for the garage door. So this one is a requirement that is already written and it has some problems. So we're saying while closing the door should, oh, sorry. I started to share my screen and then it didn't share. There we go. Okay. So here's a requirement that we already have written. And yeah, as I mentioned, there's some problems here. So, we don't have an imperative. We're saying should, which is not obviously clear that this needs to be done. in an optional escape clause. So we're not, we're not saying that this is actually marked as required. And we have a non-specific kind of timing constraint, so temporarily. What does that actually mean? We need to be more clear and specific. But when we look at this one, we're saying while closing, the door should temporarily stop in the event of a system obstruction. So when we look at it, it is kind of fitting into the state driven. It's not quite compliant. And I think what's happening here is it's actually a complex requirement. So we're talking about kind of two, we're talking about like a precondition, and we're also talking about an unwanted behavior, so another trigger. So a good one to use for this, I would say, is state-driven and unwanted behavior. So one thing I like to always say about the complex is that they're not quite, they're more detailed. You're being more specific. So where is state-driven and unwanted? There we go. So very quickly, I'll kind of go through this. So in this case, the precondition is while the garage door opener is closing, because then we're going to be talking about, it being able to stop in the event of a system obstruction. So this is an undesired trigger. So if the door sensor detects an obstruction, then the garage door opener shall, which is our imperative, and then our system response in this case shall stop the garage door. And I think I realized this is just if the garage door is closing. So, here we're trying to kind of describe something just with state driven, but it actually is talking about a precondition and a trigger. So I know we're just at time now. I know that was kind of a quick way to go through it, but as I mentioned, we will be going through more complex ones at our next webinar.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for participating today and for taking your time to join us today. Sorry we weren't able to get to this question at the end here, Katrina, but we'll follow up with you afterwards and have a little chat about that. But that actually kind of leads in well to our upcoming webinars. So if that's an area that you're interested in, I highly suggest signing up for those webinars once that date comes out. But again, this is information that we'll have available for everybody through our marketing information, and then again through our virtual events page on the QRA website. So please stay in touch, please stay on top of things. And if you do have any interest in communicating afterwards, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear your questions and love to understand the particular situation at your organization. Thanks again.